Let's talk about Chapter 6, How Cells Harvest Chemical Energy. Now, the way the book talks about this, and we've talked about how to look at books, right? So make sure you look at the parts, the big parts of the chapter, because I may tell you that some of the parts of the chapter are more important than others. And so, as a matter of fact, here, my focus is not so much on the anaerobic harvesting of energy. You should have the basics of this, but the big things that I want you to really, the big ideas I want you to really focus on is the harvesting of energy with cellular respiration, and then the stages of cellular respiration. We'll touch on fermentation and the connection between metabolic pathways, but it's not central to what I'm trying to accomplish here. So let's talk about harvesting of aerobic energy. So one of the things I think we can all agree on is that life requires energy, right? And in all ecosystems, one of the things you're supposed to learn from biology class is that everything always comes from the sun in the end. In the end, that's where it all comes from. If the sun dies, everything else dies with it. And when photosynthesis happens, and we're going to talk about photosynthesis in the next chapter, and I will never understand why this book didn't put photosynthesis first, but that's neither here nor there. So in photosynthesis, the sunlight, the energy in the sunlight is used to rearrange the atoms in carbon dioxide and water, and it produces an organic molecule, also called glucose, and it releases oxygen. In cellular respiration, then, you have this oxygen that's consumed, and the organic molecules, speak glucose, are broken down to CO2 and H2O. And the energy that's really that was captured in these molecules is, the book says, released as ATP. It is actually stored in ATP, because ATP is an energy currency that contains energy. So um, so this is what this whole thing looks like, right? So you've got sunlight coming in, photosynthesis creates glucose and oxygen. Um, then the mitochondria take this energy and turn it into a energy that the cells can use, ATP, and we exhale. Their waste products are carbon dioxide and water, which is then back picked up by the sun. Now, back to big picture for a moment. One of the things we need for mitochondria to do what they do is oxygen, right? So, one of the things that we got to make sure about is that we understand the difference in biology class. And in English class, we don't quite make those distinction. There's the distinction between breathing and respiration. Breathing is oxygen in, CO2 out. Respiration is what happens in the cell, as far as that's as far as biology class is concerned, right? So the oxygen that you're breathing in is transported in the bloodstream to the cells that carry out mitochondria, that carry out cellular respiration. So that's how it gets there. And the CO2 gets transported back to the lungs from the cells that way. Now, a couple of things to know about cellular respiration. It's an exergonic, i.e., energy releasing process. And because it releases energy, this released energy is captured in the form of ATP. So it captures about only 34% of the available energy. So the rest of it is lost. But 34%, that's actually very good. I think I think we capture about that, maybe a little less in our gasoline engine. And when you're looking at a car engine, a car gets hot when it drives, right? That's the same thing. It's the same idea. You have a very similar energy source. Um, the efficiency of the machine determines how hot it runs. Those of you who are old enough remember really, really old light bulbs. They got really, really hot. That's because they were not efficient at all at actually really creating light. They created heat more than they created light. So the overall, when we're looking at this chemically, we've got glucose and oxygen going into the system to do cellular respiration, and carbon dioxide, water, and ATP and heat coming out of the system. The You require a constant supply of energy. Even if you're sitting around, you require a constant supply of energy. And the cellular respiration is the thing that provides the energy, both for, your heart to pump, your stomach to do its thing, and for you to, swim, bike, run, whatever the case may be. Um, Depending on calories in, calories out, your body really is a calculator. Now, it may be true that some of us are more efficient than others at utilizing the energy, and that's really just too bad for you. But if your body only needs, if your body needs 3,000 calories, then bringing in 3,000 calories will maintain your body weight. If you bring in more, you will not. If your body needs 800 calories, you're going to eat very few French fries if you want to maintain your if you want to maintain your body weight. Um, So how is this energy captured though? So how do the mitochondria capture this energy from the fuel molecules? Um, there is this thing, it's called an electron transport chain. And basically what an electron transport chain is, you've heard about electrons, right? You've heard about bonds. So these bonds are created because electrons go from one molecule from one atom to another, and that creates a bond. But if there's an atom sitting next to you that wants this electron more than you do, it's going to get passed along. So the basically what happens is that this, I don't like the fact that they call it falling, because what it really is, it gets passed, the electron gets passed along an electron transport chain down to, up to the biggest bully, which is oxygen. And so what you're looking here is you're looking basically at an oxidation reaction. So oxygen, in the end, oxygen gains electrons because that's what oxygen does. And so oxygen is reduced to water, and glucose becomes oxidized, which breaks it down. That's the overall calculation. Um, And who's involved in that are, so you start out with an organic fuel, which is glucose, right? Um, at the end of that, you have the oxidized fuel, which is CO2. And then you have a dehydrogenase that helps with this production, and then the passing along of the electrons. Then the electrons go down the electron transport chain, and in the end, oxygen is the electron acceptor. What chemical characteristic of the element oxygen counts for its function in cellular respiration? It's the fact that it's the most electronegative of everyone. So it is the biggest bully. It will grab electrons from just about anywhere it can get its hands on. So let's look at the stages of cellular respiration, because there's a couple of different places. There's a couple of different stages that are happening here. So stage one, and I want you to kind of remember where these stages are happening, because that actually is sort of important. So there's the first stage is glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol. And because it's in the cytosol, it's probably one of the oldest processes that we have for trying to capture energy. So it's the start of the cellular respiration, and probably for the very old organisms, it was also the end of cellular respiration. It takes down glucose into two molecules of a three-carbon compound called pyruvate, and that's all that happens in the cytosol. Then the pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle take place in the mitochondria. And remember, I told you before that we think that the mitochondria were at some point captured, as that they were free living organisms at one point. Um, and so it's kind of curious that this energy, right? We had a very rudimentary energy provision system going on, and now with the mitochondria, you have a completely different. It's a completely different ball game. So pyruvate is oxidized, so it goes into the mitochondria, and this completes the breakdown of glucose to carbon dioxide, and it supplies the third stage of the respiration with electrons. So if you're looking at this like this, so you've got glycolysis that happens in the cytosol, and this happens in both in both plant and animal cells. So both plant and animal cells have mitochondria. Students oftentimes forget that plant cells also have mitochondria, because plant cells also need a way to actually utilize the fuel they stored. Because at night they don't have sunlight, right? So at night they need to utilize they need to actually utilize the glucose they stored. So then it goes into the mitochondrium. Pyruvate oxidation happens here, then the citric acid cycle, and then here is oxidative phosphorylation, which gives you the biggest bang for your buck. So that is where most of the ATP is being created. So there's a little bit of ATP there, there's a little bit of ATP there, but this is where the most ATP is being created. Um, so this is where oxidative phosphorylation happens, and we're going to look at oxidative phosphorylation in just a second. But basically, what oxidative phosphorylation is it is electron transport and chemiosmosis. And again, we'll talk about in a second about what that means. It's a big word, but it's actually not that big of a concept. Um, so what happens is NADH and FADH2 shuttle electrons to that electron transport chain that's embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Um, and the what happens with these they produce an a proton gradient, um, which then allows ATP to be produced by oxidative phosphorylation. And the electrons in the end are passed to oxygen, which then becomes reduced to H2O. Did I just skip one? No. So let's talk about ATP for just a second, because I keep talking about ATP and ADP. Basically, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It's an adenosine with three phosphates on it, and the energy that's released when that one phosphate is that last phosphate, that triple phosphate, is very wiggly, and when it goes, it releases energy. And so ATP is used to prime this glucose molecule, and it splits in two. So that's glycolysis. And a picture is worth a thousand words. So ATP primes this molecule and turns it into pyruvate. Now, all of these processes are facilitated by things called enzymes. And that's really one of the more important things we got to talk about here. So when you have an enzyme sometimes needs to be driven by things. And so an enzyme does things like, so for example, this enzyme here is the enzyme that puts the phosphate onto the ATP. So you have an ADP that doesn't have a whole lot of energy on it. And then you have an enzyme that takes this phosphate and sticks it on there, which then you don't have a phosphate anymore here. But this ADP has an ATP now, um, and then it can go on and do things. So there are multiple steps that split glucose into two molecules, and some of these steps consume energy, some of these steps yield energy. And this is one of the things about biochemical pathways. That's how biochemical pathways function. Is there's usually a connection between processes that yield energy and processes that consume energy. Um, and if those, if that's balanced, then you can have cyclical processes that are happening. Citric acid cycle. Let's look at the picture instead. So basically, what you need to know about the citric acid cycle is that it's basically the preparation for the next step. Now, the citric acid cycle is where CO2 is being released, and where acetyl CoA comes into that cycle. And the next step, yeah, don't worry about this stuff. This is more trouble than it's worth. But this is what I really want you to look at. So, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. So, once you've gone through glycolysis and the pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle, you get to the oxidative phosphorylation. In order for oxidative phosphorylation to work, you need to have a membrane. And in this membrane are a bunch of molecules, a bunch of proteins. And this thing is the electron transport chain. So these things are the electron transport chain. And what happens is this NADH comes in, and it gets converted because of that H plus, it gets converted into NADH plus, NAD plus, and this proton is pumped into into the inner membrane space of the mitochondrium. That's what all of these guys do. So this electron that's being shuttled through this system, and that ends up in oxygen at the end. This electron facilitates the movement of protons into the inner membrane space. How exactly that does that, we don't need to know. That's beyond our scope. But what it sets up here is a gradient, because you end up with a whole lot of protons here and very few protons there. And we know from diffusion that things want to move from a high concentration to a low concentration. And so these protons here, they're going to be looking for a place to leave. And the place they're going to find to leave is this thing right here. This thing right here is called ATP synthase. And the ATP synthase is basically a turbine. It literally is a turbine. And when these protons enter, it's kind of like a waterfall. They drive this turbine around, and the movement of the turbine provides enough energy for this ADP for this ATP synthase to add a phosphate to ADP, creating ATP. And while these others produce like 2 or so ATPs, this process produces way more ATP. Where's the number? We don't have a number. I think it's 32. I think it's 32 ATPs if all goes well. Now here is the, do we care? Here's the yield. That's what I was looking for. So here's the yield you're looking for. So 2 ADPs, 2 ATPs, 32 ATPs is what you're coming up with in the end, and 28 just from oxidative phosphorylation. And this only works though because remember ATP was this really wiggly molecule. If the ATPs aren't at the right place where they're needed, they'll get wasted. And again, every time one of those things blows up, anytime one of those phosphate goes away, it just shoots out its energy into whatever direction. And that again contributes to the amount of heat um, that is being um, that is being produced as these processes go on. As I told you, I'm not too terribly concerned about fermentation, but basically, what fermentation is, it's a way of harvesting energy without requiring oxygen. Um, and so, this is something that can happen in aerobic conditions. This can happen to you in your muscle cells when your muscle cells run out of glucose while you're exercising, for example. Um, and this leads to lactic acid fermentation or alcohol fermentation. Um, so in the muscles, it leads to lactic acid fermentation. And lactic acid fermentation is the thing that makes you have sore muscles when you exercise. So the process looks something like this. And this ethanol here, right? When we do fermentation and we do it right, we can capture this ethanol in big bottles and big vats, and we end up drinking it as to imbibe ourselves with it. But yeah, I think that's basically all you need to know about this. Um, I did mention that glycolysis happened in the cytosol, so it's probably a very, very old process. Um, there are most of our organic biochemical pathways are connected in some way, shape, or form. So while I talk about you getting energy mostly from glucose, and I keep on talking about glucose, the reality is that fats and proteins also can be converted into the building blocks that are necessary for oxidative phosphorylation. So carbohydrates are the quickest one. So simple sugars, those are woof. They give you energy quick. But fats, they also give you energy via the glycerol or through the fatty acids via the acetyl CoA. And proteins can enter the cycle in a couple of different places. This is the primary source, right? This is the primary backup source, and proteins basically are the secondary backup source um, to your in order to when all else fails. So if you were to try to live on a diet of mostly fats and proteins and almost no sugar, like the Atkins diet, right? That works, right? Because you can also get that, but it's not your body works a little harder to get there.